All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving into a scenario that's both kind of eerie and strangely fascinating. We're going to be exploring what happens to the world if, and this is a big if, humans suddenly disappear. Just poof, gone.
It's a thought experiment that really forces you to think about our impact, on the planet. It also makes you think about just how complex the systems we've created are, not to mention the natural world itself.
Exactly. And to explore all of that, we're diving into a whole bunch of YouTube videos that tackle this question from every angle you can think of. Ecological impacts, what happens to animals, cities crumbling, even what happens to nuclear power plants. It's like having, like 10 different lenses to view this massive what if.
And what's so crazy is how fast everything starts to fall apart, like dominoes. It really shows you just how reliant we are on all these systems that we just take for granted.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The sources we're looking at, they all paint this picture of almost instant chaos. Power grids, for example, they'd start failing within hours because no one's there to keep those plants running.
Right. Just imagine the London Underground flooding, New York City going completely dark, planes falling out of the sky. It's immediate and it's dramatic.
It really makes you think about those communities, like the ones that already live off the grid. Would they even notice a difference? It's interesting because none of the sources actually address that.
That's a good point. You're right. It really challenges that assumption that we're all equally vulnerable, when something like this happens.
Yeah. And it's not just the big obvious stuff either. One video actually pointed out that even the average temperature in cities would drop without all the body heat from millions of people. It's a tiny detail, but it really shows how closely tied we are to our environment, even in ways we don't always think about.
It's like this low-grade fever that the planet wouldn't even notice is gone, which kind of leads to a bigger question, right? Like, how resilient is nature compared to the impact we have? We spend so much effort trying to control nature, but everything we're seeing suggests it would take over incredibly fast.
Oh, for sure. And it's not just fast. It's almost poetic when you think about it. Skyscrapers crumbling, streets turning into rivers, plants taking over everything. There are these crazy descriptions of Times Square turning into a garden, hogweed just going wild along the Thames. It's wild to think how quickly nature adapts and fills the void. It's like it's been waiting for us to disappear.
And, it's not just visual either. Think about what happens in ecology, like that process of succession. It wouldn't just be random plants and animals. Different species would come in, they'd compete, they'd reshape the whole landscape over time. It makes you wonder what the word wilderness even means in a world without people.
So if we fast forward a few decades, maybe even centuries, would those little urban gardens eventually turn into forests? What kinds of animals would live in those environments? It makes you realize that nature reclimbing the planet isn't just a one-time event. It's this whole process that would keep going with its own set of rules.
Absolutely. And, we can't forget about the animal kingdom either. For them, it would be this huge reshuffling. Some, like whales and a lot of birds, they probably do really well without us around. But what about domesticated animals? All of a sudden, they're on their own in a world that they were never meant to handle.
Yeah, like kicking them out of the nest before they can fly.
Yeah.
It's hard to say what would happen to them. Some of the sources talk about cockroaches dying out in cities because there's no more heat. But then you've got feral pigs that could end up thriving and even evolving.
It's not even just about surviving, though. It's about evolution. Like, without humans messing with their environments and their breeding, these pigs could go through some big changes. Imagine, thicker fur for the cold or bigger tusks for digging up roots. Maybe even traits they lost from being domesticated would come back.
Yeah, it's like evolution gets to hit the reset button for some species. One source even mentioned dogs forming packs again, maybe even mixing with wolves. Would that create a new kind of dog, like a mix of domesticated and wild traits? It makes you wonder, what traits are really desirable, versus what helps you survive when we're not around to decide?
It's like we think of desirable based on our needs, but without us, nature would have its own rules, its own idea of what it means to be successful.
Exactly. And speaking of things we can't control, we've got to talk about the big scary thing, nuclear power. And the sources we're looking at, they don't try to sugarcoat it. Nuclear power plants all over the world would start exploding within days if we weren't here to run them.
And the fallout would be terrible. Think about it. An area the size of a city block, suddenly it's as radioactive as the inside of an X-ray machine. Imagine hundreds of times the radiation of Hiroshima. You'd have ecological devastation, contamination that would last for hundreds of years.
Yeah. It's scary to think that even if we vanished instantly, all that nuclear power would still be a threat for generations.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way to even understand how much radiation we're talking about?
Well, some of the sources say it would be like setting off hundreds of Hiroshima bombs all at once. And the radiation from those specific elements like cesium-137 and strontium-90, they have half-lives of decades, so it's not like it just disappears overnight. It would be contaminating the environment for a very long time.
That's a lot to think about. It makes
Yeah.
you realize that the choices we make today, they have consequences, right? We talk about sustainability and saving the planet, but this shows how much of a threat we are to ourselves and to future generations too.
Yeah, I agree. It's a reminder that nature might eventually recover from this, but it would take a really, really long time. Thousands of years, maybe even tens of thousands, for some of those contaminated places to be okay again. It puts our lifespan into perspective, doesn't it?
It's overwhelming to think about. Even if we were gone, what we did would affect the planet for thousands of years. But there's still so much more to think about. What happens to our cities, the things we built, our art? What kind of legacy are we leaving, good or bad?
And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into next. So get ready to explore that long view, the things that would be left over from human civilization, and what it all means for us and how we understand our place in the world.
So we've talked about how nature would take over pretty quickly if humans disappeared. But what about all this stuff we leave behind? You know, our cities, our art, even our trash. What happens to all of that? It's kind of like imagining some future archaeologist trying to figure out what human civilization was all about.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. The sources we looked at suggest that we'd leave behind this kind of layered history with some materials lasting way longer than others. Like take Mount Rushmore, for instance. It's carved into granite, right? That's a material that could last for millions of years, even with erosion.
So you're saying that this monument, which is meant to represent national pride and, well, permanence, could actually outlast pretty much everything else we've ever built. That's kind of ironic, don't you think?
Yeah, a little bit. And while all our steel and concrete buildings would rust and crumble eventually because of nature, of course, some metals might leave behind some interesting clues, like bronze statues. They could keep their shape for like tens of millions of years.
Wow, okay. So imagine some future civilization coming across a bronze statue of a human, maybe even one of those like heroic figures we love to put on a pedestal. What would they think? Would they be impressed, curious, maybe even a little scared?
That's a question for philosophers, I guess. But from a purely scientific point of view, these leftovers would give them a lot of information about the materials we used and our technology. They might even be able to get DNA from fossilized remains so they could get a glimpse of our biology.
That's pretty amazing. And a little creepy, too. But let's not forget about the elephant in the room. Plastic. It's everywhere, and it's not going away anytime soon.
You got that right. Plastic doesn't break down like organic stuff. It just keeps getting smaller and smaller, becoming those microplastics that stick around for centuries, maybe even millennia.
It really makes you think about our throwaway culture, doesn't it? Like even long after we're gone, our plastic waste would still be polluting the oceans and the soil, maybe even affecting how life evolves after us. Makes you think twice about using that plastic water bottle, huh?
Definitely. And you know, speaking of things that have long-lasting consequences, we should come back to nuclear power plants. We've talked about the explosions, but the long-term effects on the environment and how life evolves would be huge.
Yeah, one source described it as these radioactive zones creating this kind of unnatural selection. It's like evolution on fast forward, maybe leading to all sorts of new species and adaptations that we could never have imagined. It's kind of freaky, to be honest.
You could have organisms that develop ways to repair their DNA better, or even organisms that can live in places with high radiation. It's a wild thought, but it shows how powerful life is, how it can adapt and survive even in the toughest conditions.
So it's almost like even if we're not around, we're still shaping how life on Earth evolves, but in a way we never intended. It makes you wonder, are there other ways our absence could affect evolution?
Well, think about something called genetic drift. Without humans controlling how domesticated animals breed, random mutations and chance events would have a much bigger impact on their evolution. We might see all kinds of different traits popping up, some good, some bad. It's like nature rolling the dice, and who knows what the outcome will be.
So it's not just about the radiation. It's just the fact that we're gone that could change how life evolves in ways we can only imagine. It's pretty fascinating and a bit scary at the same time. What do you think?
I agree. And it really highlights something that comes up again and again in these videos, how everything is connected. From the tiniest microbe to the biggest ecosystem, what we do has effects that can last for a long time and spread far and wide.
Okay, so we talked about the little details like plastic bits and evolving pigs, but now I want to zoom out and think about the big picture. What does a world without humans tell us about how we treat the planet right now? What's the main takeaway here?
I think it boils down to one basic truth. The Earth doesn't need us to survive. In fact, like we've seen, it might even be better off without us. But us, we need this planet to survive. We depend on it completely.
Right. It's a good reminder that we're not in charge of nature. We're just a part of it. We're connected to all living things and those delicate systems that keep us alive. It's easy to forget that in our everyday lives.
Totally. And while the sources we looked at paint a pretty dark picture of what would happen right after we're gone, they also give us some hope. They show how resilient and adaptable nature is, how it can recover and rebuild even after we've messed things up pretty badly.
Yeah, it's like the planet is always trying to find a balance to restore itself even when things get disrupted, whether it's natural or because of something we did.
Exactly. And maybe that's the most important thing we can learn from all of this. It's not about getting caught up in all the bad stuff that could happen. It's about recognizing how powerful nature is, how it can heal and adapt. And it's about figuring out how to live in a way that doesn't harm the planet.
So it's not just about surviving in a world without humans. It's about learning how to live well in the world we have now.
Exactly. And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore what that could look like. We'll talk about the choices we can make today to create a better future for us and for this amazing planet we call home.
All right, so we've really gone deep into this whole what-if scenario, picturing cities collapsing, ecosystems changing, and even how our actions would affect things long after we're gone. But let's bring it back down to earth for a minute. What can we actually learn from all of this? Like, what can we do with this knowledge, both as individuals and as a society?
That's the big question, right? It's easy to get caught up in all the dramatic stuff, like nature taking over the planet. But I think the real lesson here is what it tells us about how we treat the earth right now.
Yeah, I agree. It's not just some, like, end-of-the-world movie. It's about understanding how our choices have consequences.
One thing that really stood out to me from the sources is just how connected everything is. It's like this giant web, and even our smallest actions can have effects throughout the whole system.
Right, like that example they gave with the quagga mussels, those little things that were clogging up the Hoover Dam's pipes. And that actually contributed to the dam collapsing, which then changed the whole Colorado River ecosystem. It's crazy to think something so small can have such a big impact.
It's true, and it's not just about physical systems either. Think about how we affect the environment. Carbon emissions, plastic pollution, deforestation. All of these things have consequences that can be felt all over the world for generations to come.
So it's not just those images of polar bears on melting ice, right? It's realizing that every choice we make, from what we eat to how we get around, it's all part of this bigger picture. But it's not all bad news either. The sources also talked about how positive actions, like cutting back on our carbon footprint or supporting sustainable practices, can have those same ripple effects, but in a good way.
Yeah, for sure. It's like a message of warning, but also hope. We have the power to change the future, and this thought experiment really shows how much responsibility we have as caretakers of this planet.
It also makes you think about the long term. You know what I mean? It's easy to focus on what's happening right now in our own lives.
Yeah.
But this makes us think about the consequences that will last even after we're gone, the legacy we leave behind for whoever or whatever comes after us.
Absolutely. And if we want to create a truly sustainable future, we have to change the way we think. We have to stop thinking about just taking and using and start seeing ourselves as part of this bigger web of life.
And maybe, like some of the sources said, it's also about seeing the value in nature just for what it is, not just for what it can do for us. Like appreciating the beauty of ecosystems, how everything's connected, and protecting those things just because they're amazing.
Yeah, that would be a big shift in how we think. But I think it's really important if we want to deal with the challenges we're facing in the 21st century. It's about moving away from that idea that humans are at the center of everything and realizing that we're just one part of a much bigger, more complicated picture.
It's about understanding that we're not separate from nature, we're part of it. How well we do is completely tied to how healthy the planet is. It's not just about saving the Earth, it's about saving ourselves too.
Exactly. And in a way, thinking about a world without humans lets us see our own world in a new way. We can see how fragile it is, but also how strong and resilient it is. And we can see how much of an impact we have, both good and bad.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling a mix of, I don't know, awe and responsibility. Like, I'm amazed by how vast and complex nature is and how life can adapt and survive even without us. But I also feel this weight of responsibility, knowing that the choices we make every day have these huge consequences that we can't always see.
It's definitely humbling, but it's also empowering. We have the power to shape the future, to build a world that's good for both people and the planet. A world where we can all thrive together, and not just for ourselves, but for all the life that will come after us.
So to all of you listening, we leave you with this. What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? What can you do starting today to create a world that's more beautiful, more fair, and more sustainable? Those are probably the most important questions we can ask ourselves. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.